This is live. We're doing a hangout. Hangout on air. Broadcasted live to tens of people. Nothing about functional, so we'll start with it. And you have a good room here. You have to talk to the entire room.
Yeah, this works. I'm used to like 100 people.
Yeah, they have to make eye contact. Did you turn your mic on?
It's not on.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Brendan Dwyer. I'm proud to introduce Enoch Hale, who's going to be doing our session this afternoon on portfolios. Just a reminder, please silence yourself. That's it.
Okay. So my name is Enoch Hale, and I work here at VCU in the Academic Learning Transformation Lab, people that are helping sponsor this activity. And so today we're talking about reconceptualizing e-portfolios and finding tools that are free to help students do this. And I was thinking about this at 2 in the morning, actually, last night. Well, what is it? What's its essence? Essence is about two concepts: power and integrity. I'm going to argue now, and I encourage you to disagree with me, right? But I'm going to argue that our current way of conceptualizing portfolios and e-portfolios perpetuates a power dynamic that secures power within the evaluator's hands and actually disempowers students. I'm going to furthermore argue that if we are to actually be an institution, instructors that have an inkling or committed to integrity, practicing what we preach, we need to flip that power dynamic. Finally, I'm going to show you it just takes a little nudge and that it can scale out. Now, that sounds like a lot, but I'm going to highlight my first attempt at this here at VCU in an undergraduate general education course and show you how students began to work with that. So it's about power and integrity. That's the key ideas. But to get to that point in 45 minutes, I think it's necessary to kind of really introduce us to one of the big obstacles to making the shift. So I'm going to ask you individually, if you have something to write with, computer, or phone, I don't care, or piece of paper, I'm going to show you a video, and I'm going to ask that, and where's the mouse? All right, I'm going to ask that all you got to do is I want you to watch the film, and I want you to analyze it, okay? I want you to analyze the film, but I want you to analyze it through questions. So you're going to watch it and write questions down that you think unpack the meaning of the film. All right, that's all the directions I'm going to give you. This is short, it's like 2 minutes. So, everyone clear on the directions? Here we go. All right, we're all educated here. We're all smart. Let's just take a minute and individually, don't talk to anybody, but individually write down a few questions that you think analyze the meaning of the film, but state them interrogatively in the form of a question. Let's just take a minute, think about it. All right, if you'd like to turn to a person sitting near you and share questions and see if you could come up with a few more. Remember, your point, your purpose is to analyze the film, right? So you're trying to unpack its meaning. So turn to someone sitting next to you, share your ideas, read your questions. So maybe you all could create a group of 3. Maybe you could jump in with these. All right, if I can interrupt, please. Excuse me. Okay. So I'm sure we could spend quite a bit of time unpacking this in this form, right? But the clock's a ticking. So I'd like to ask for a few volunteer questions. Analyzing the film. Tell me, right, please.
When is conformity appropriate?
When is conformity appropriate? All right, good question. What's another one? Yeah.
Is there such a thing as free will?
Is there such a thing as free will, as socialized beings? Yeah, very good. Yeah. What role does space have any play? Yeah, so looking at the context, absolutely. What else? Yes?
What are our underlying assumptions or beliefs about how the elevator ride works?
Oh, this is making me salivate now. That's good. Yeah.
What effect does laugh track have on our perception?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
What effect does laugh track have
On our perception as viewers. Okay, so I'm sure we can unpack, and there's a critical thinking there's a few points here that I could surface, and I think that one of them is individually, I can ask a limited number of questions. Collectively, there's more minds at work, and I can ask more. The problem, though, is that even collectively, our work is heavily influenced by our concept of what analysis is. And even though we are we're educated in it, we can move through a variety of texts and mediums analytically, when we translate that to student thinking and performance, what happens is we might model good thinking, and that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. If we model good thinking, we cater to the elite student. Student who might have the natural cognitive abilities, socioeconomic status, conditions, resources, the network. All of these, and those students are largely predictable. They largely succeed despite us. But if we're looking at responsibility to all our students, something more than just modeling good thinking is important. I'm going to argue that if we use a framework or frameworks to explicitly guide the way we interface with concepts, as an instructor, I can design learning activities that surface concrete intellectual moves that I can assess, that I can help direct and redirect. So for example, I think about the question largely, what's the intellectual product I want to result from this assignment? Meaning not product like economic terms, but product in terms of like insight, skill I want them to have practice in, disposition I am targeting. If I can't answer that, what's the probability I'm going to help students craft work that helps them develop the skills necessary to not just survive, but thrive in the coming century? So for example, I took this out of a 3rd grade math book. I actually rewrote it because it was unclear. And it was in a chapter on subtraction. And it was one of many like it. And like 12 Christmas trees standing. Of those, 5 are cut down. How many are left standing? So I asked myself, like moves on a chessboard. See, if I'm playing the game of chess, I'm thinking about patterns. I'm thinking strategically. I'm thinking through implications. I'm not thinking about just the next move. I'm thinking possibly 5, 10. The best are thinking 19 moves ahead. Right? I'm looking at systems, thinking strategically. So I ask, what intellectual moves of the mind, what are students doing when they go to work through them? Like, what do you think? If I give students this type of question, what am I asking them to do up here in 3rd grade, mind you?
Visualize.
Visualize, absolutely. So we're trying to take mathematical concepts and think of them and visualize them, think in terms of images. What else? This isn't like brain busters, so don't overthink it. Yeah.
Well, they have to read.
Okay, they have to be able to decode. And in decoding, we teach them that the word left helps them identify an operation, which is subtraction. Then they create an algorithm, and then they have to successfully execute the algorithm, right? That's what's embedded. It's those important moves. But if that's what we give students only, then we're robbing them of a lot of being empowered thinkers. And so I think of it this way. Giving them the opportunity might involve rephrasing periodically, not every time, of course, the question so that the emphasis is not on the answer, it's on the reasoning. Like Susan said, if there are 12 Christmas trees standing and of those 5 are cut down, then 7 are left standing. But George says that's incorrect. Who's correct and why, and how did you arrive at your answer? You're having to explain why subtraction is the most appropriate operation. Okay, that's 3rd grade. But what if we like throw it down? I took this one out of a book called Engaging Ideas from John Bean. It's one of those books I wish I wrote. Now, how many of you have had assignments like this? Or have given assignments like this, right? I have. You know what this is like saying? Highlight anything you think is important. It's like saying, analyze that film. It's leaving it up to you to interpret what that word means. And more often than not, the student is assuming, or I might put it this way, the student is looking for what they think you want, rather than genuinely and strategically entering into the investigation. So we want to change this. And this is going somewhere, so just hold with me for a second. But what if we rewrote it? Like in a group of 3, propose a list of significant questions you'd like to have the teacher address or the class discuss regarding Plato's Credo. Your initial list, put your hand in, should include a dozen or so questions. Then reach consensus on what you consider your 3 best questions. Your recorder will write these questions on the board and will explain to the class why your group considers them pertinent, interesting, and significant questions raised by the Credo. You have 15 minutes. What's the difference in the thinking? It's directed. I know what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to think through the text in terms of the concept of questions. Interesting, so there's criteria at play. Significant, pertinent. They have to come to consensus. They have to defend. before they're even addressed. So my point here is, how often do we give students directions that assume intellectual moves are clearly understood? Now, I could show you another one. I have to show it to you before we get to the real meat of this. And a friend of mine, oops, oops, that's great. A friend of mine, she approached me and gave me this, she said she was having problems with her class. It was an undergraduate class at a very prestigious institution. Her students, semester after semester, were failing this paper. I said, all right, send me the prompt, we'll see what's going on. This was one paragraph in the prompt. All right, so this wasn't like the whole prompt. That was the first problem. But my point here is to highlight how often our assumptions can disempower students. So you can get an idea here. The people we graded, this is just out of the assessment section, on how deeply and extensively you're able to analyze a primary source, so on and so forth. You know, care and thought put into your analyzing the limitations of a particular document, not. That's a lot. So I said, I want you to unpack this by highlighting the process words. So, and that analyze, present, connect, refer, analyze limitations, discuss, organize. I said, give any one of those words to students, all of your students, and ask them to define them and see what range of definitions you get. Out of 40 students, guess how many definitions she got? She got 40. There are similarities, but it just goes to show that what they're really doing is just waiting to really say, let me produce work that you tell me, oh, but here's my work, you tell me how good it is. Rather than, let me tell you how to read this work because I have a clear understanding of how it's organized and the direction it's taking. Now, those are just process words. What if we went to like the criteria, the evaluative words? Same phenomena. They're thinking words, but they're just words. They become tools when students understand how to interface with them. I had them list them out. And this is what like Tishman, Perkins, and Jay up at Harvard talked about as cultivating a thinking language. They're just words, but they're tools when we know how to do things with them. So we go back to the concept of say, analysis. These, by the way, were just from that one paragraph, right? And if we're going to have students produce work that can be put into a portfolio and they can speak to its logic in a way that really captures what they have learned and what they can do, something more than assuming, providing them with an experience that assumes they understand it or have interfaced with it deeply is needed. So let's take that word analyze. Had I said, I want you to go back now and look at the film and analyze it by asking questions, but for your first round of analysis, I want you to focus on exposing the concepts embedded within the film. We heard some of them. What about the concept of conformity? Right? What about the concept of humor? Right? What about the concept of, say, as you're saying, space? Right? All right, now let's focus again, and let's focus on point of view as an analytical lens. Perspective. What about the perspective of the subject, the perspective of the people in on it, right? The perspective of the editor, the perspective of me as the audience member. They now somehow have a whole bunch more lenses by which I can consciously and systematically ask questions to enter into it. What about assumptions? What about implications? What about connections? Well, if I assume this is true, what else does this commit me to? Do I have any ideas or can I make any connections of other research that it might help me understand this better? What about Solomon Ash's work or Stanley Milgram's work? And that's just like reeks with this type of concept. So that doesn't even mean like the idea of somebody surface over here, the idea of context or the idea of, let's say, assumption. I said assumptions. What about the idea of like what claims are embedded within it? Or there's so many different analytical lenses, but we have come to do this implicitly well. And we know it when we see it. But to what extent have I made it explicit so students can strategically use it? Now, here's what I tried to do last year, and I'm scaling it up this next semester. I argued that this is our class website, is UNIV 200. I argued that, you know what? If you create your e-portfolios and you put your work first, you're in a passive role. Here, employer, here, professor, judge my thinking on criteria to which I do not really command. I don't understand deeply. So how can we change that slightly to empower the student? I argued that what we first need to do is expose the thinking language that points to skills that you'll be practicing in the classroom. So we developed this thing. I called it metaphorically the backpack, but it could also be, a toolbox or I don't know, whatever else. And whenever people would come up with a concept, say you asked a question, oh, could you give me an example? I'd stop class and say, everybody write that down. She just asked a question of clarification. Can you give me an example? And we'd begin to slowly amass this body of resources. So the word clarity became from being a word to a tool. I know that it's a basis. When I'm asking clarifying questions, I can highlight a few of these. I have a framework. So if I said to students, enter in, I want you to question each other, focus your questions on clarification, they had a foundation by which to begin. In this class, of course, there's so many moves, but the ones that are relevant to the flow of the class started with clarification, and we put it into this timeline. It's called Timeline Jess, I'll show you. And it's really based on history. And I said, no, let's use it for our portfolios. The students created their own at the end of the term, where no longer is the work first. It's the thinking that's first. The work is just a mere example. So that way, it's not them putting what they perceive as their best work forward. It's now a timeline of their intellectual growth. And they can say, I have developed skills in being motivated. When the material's boring, I just don't find it interesting. How can I go about being interested in it? And these are what I've done throughout my term. And guess what? They would then cite, so I put up there our website. They wrote these questions. If we scrolled down, you could see their thinking as they blogged on it, and we refined it and came to consensus. But the idea was to take this idea of motivation and make it something that's usable as a reflective tool and evaluative tool. They would then, where that website is there, they'd have their paper, and I'll show you an example. And they would then link out, you could see within their paper where they're talking about how to connect with the concept or the principle or the topic. Right? So we just moved through highlighting these different ideas. Let me show on this one here. It's is this the one? It's not going to come up, unfortunately, right now. But it was the CRAP test on assessing the validity of sources. Now, the concept that I think is central here is to really hold our own institutions accountable. This is our quality enhancement plan, like part of the, this is the summary. But at the bottom, you'll see here, I highlighted this word there, generalizable education. How do you help students transfer insights, skills, and attitudes or dispositions outside of your classroom and into other domains of their life? Not suggesting every intellectual move is appropriate, but there are some that are. How are you helping them? What opportunities, or I should put it this way, to what extent are we holding them accountable for explicitly making those connections? By putting the thinking first, that concept of generalizable education is something that I, as an instructor, am not just merely trying to check off the list. I'm driving the conversation. Like students, I want them to say, here's my portfolio. Let me tell you how to read it. Let me tell you what you're going to get out of this, and let me tell you what I can contribute to this company, to this institution, to this next class. I did a little survey of students who have been engaged with portfolios in different departments. Of the about 50 or so students that I've just been randomly targeting, one said the portfolio is valuable. And that one still doesn't use it. It was a value experience at that moment. It never goes back to it. It's not transformative. It was, and I have to ask the question, like, to what extent am I, my course, just a checkbox? And if that's the case, am I really needed? So I want to kind of disrupt that a little bit, because these terms, regardless of the fact that very smart people have been unpacking them, right? And there's rubrics, they still are abstract. And so I want students to be able to interface with these terms in deep ways. So the next iteration of the timeline portfolios that students will be doing is they'll take in our UNIV 200 core curriculum like standards that are relevant, like critical thinking, writing, information fluency, or two that will highlight. In that timeline JS, you can have multiple layers, so they can explicitly address with their work how they are practicing that concept. So if I just put it to a test, you ask your own students, all right, well, quality enhancement plan or says you have to be, a creative thinker. What do you do that embodies creative thinking? Give me 3 examples from your work. I would love to see what comes of that. Probably not much. And that's not empowering. I want students to take ownership of it. And granted, I'll be completely honest here, they don't like it. Why would they like it? Right? It's easy just to sit passively back and listen. So there is a struggle there, but I do see some transformation, and this is a student's final argument, and that's a whole nother story, which is, and part of this, I don't like this is just me, I'm not saying it's good for everybody, but I don't like the A, B, C, D, 90% and above, 80% and above. I ask students, what is an A thinker? B thinker. So if the A thinker is one who just happens to be naturally smart and fluent and good at writing, come in and just do 98% accuracy and not improve really, is that the A thinker? Or is the A thinker the one who starts out doing low-level C work, identifies their weaknesses, improves upon them systematically, can account for that improvement and do his high-level B work? Is that the A thinker? So I want there to be a deeper way to interface with the rubrics by which they're being graded. So they have to argue and cite their work throughout it. And so this narrative he constructed, and this is how he chose to do it, is then explains his timeline. And so he moves through this talking about, and this will link out to his blog, which then was one that was talking about frustrations as it relates to developing intellectual skills. One that you saw up there was on process. And so he moves through these things and is able to then cite back to the work. Of course, there's a wide degree of sophistication. And frankly, I had one student last semester who's a transfer student. English is he's bilingual, but English is his native language, and he was functionally illiterate, meaning he was could barely decode, he couldn't read out loud. And so I'm like, wow, he's a math major, I don't know if that had something to do with it, but what he was good at was the game. He knew how to help get others to help him, and he was very, very good at it. And I said, wow, how's that possible? But there's a reality to it. In the end, his timeline didn't look anything like that. But it was there, and in terms of, this is where I was, this is what I did, and this is who I am now. And I'm trying to tell students that if they exit the class the same person they entered, then I failed and they failed. What's changed? So the driving point here, and I end at 1:45, is that right? 2? Okay, good. The driving point here that I really want to bring students to is that what are you doing to take command of your thinking in such a way that you are not just experiencing, but deeply investing in the principles that are guiding your education here. And it's, we'll see what happens next semester. We're going to scale it out. That's my key point, is that the portfolios as they currently exist, they're not transformative largely. Sure, they have some exceptions. What they are is canvassing students' best work. A lot of instructors do a great job of helping students not just put the best work forward, but create that narrative. And so a question I would pose to you, as you think about how to help students put their thinking first, I like to ask two questions. The first one would be is this. If you were to take a couple minutes and write down, we'll just take the concept of thinking critically since it's a big part of what I study and it's a big part of our curriculum. If you were to write the history, a story of your intellectual development, how you have come to think critically, how you've come to command your intellect, what would you write? What would be on your timeline? What would be on your like story of your intellectual narrative? What would you write? I'll give you one quick example. I read a book when I was in my doctoral program called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. And I thought immediately, I know how to read a book. Gotten A's in the doc program. Geez, come on. And after reading the first chapter, I realized, man, I really don't know how to read a book. And one of the key insights that when you sit down, first thing you do is clarify your purpose. Now, if my purpose is to read for enjoyment, I may get something out of it, may not. If it's to read analytically, I'm committed to making certain mental steps, moves of the mind. And his point is, how explicitly aware are you of those moves? Because if you're not, then the quality of your analysis is the quality of your evaluation, your critique is going to significantly suffer. So I started figuring out what that meant. But here's the best part. I was out in my garage one day and I was building a motorcycle and I was really into that. And my wife was like, hey, Hazel, who was like 3 at the time, my daughter, she's coming, she's out here now. I'm like, okay, doing my thing. In my mind, it was like 30 seconds. Who knows how much time really elapsed. And I turned around and she wasn't there. I'm like, what? And my daughter at the time, if I yelled out for her, she just wouldn't say anything. I'm like, oh. So we lived in a cabin in the country. The nearest road was probably a couple acres away, but it was on a blind turn. No one really drove it so much, but still it was on a blind turn. More importantly, there was a creek in our yard that was like a death trap for children. And I mean, I've been in like some, let me just put it this way. That was the first time in my life I've ever felt panic. I was like freaking out. Turns out she was like right next to me in a stroller with her back turned, right? But at that point I said, oh, I'm committing myself now to being clear of purpose. If my purpose is to work on a motorcycle, that's what I'm doing. I'm not doing anything else. Leave me alone. If my purpose is to watch my daughter, that's what I'm doing. But how often are students dedicated, clear of, and dedicating themselves to purpose in a way that it's going to lead to concrete action? So that would be on my thing, my story. I want to identify my purpose. I want to be clear of that. I want to commit to it to get something done. So what would be on your story? Just with the person sitting next to you, throw out a few ideas. Because I'm arguing that why I'm having you do this is that if we're going to craft experiences to help our students develop their intellect, particularly and canvas it and capture it, and our interface, expose it in the work, we have to take what we have come to command and do implicitly well and make it explicit. Not just to model, but to use as a resource. So what do? Are you good at asking questions? If so, how? Are you good at, what do? What's on your story of intellectual development? For the next couple minutes, try to get at least 2 examples from your own life and explain that out. And I'll call on a couple people. All right, so let's take a couple minutes. With somebody, what do? What's on your intellectual story? What do you command? And how do you know you do? I guess that's it. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Excuse me. So I bet you that if we spent like a day, like really unpacking this and like aggregated all our experiences, we'd have an amazing resource. So the question that I ask myself is, as I spend time writing out my own intellectual narrative, if I were to give it to students as a guide, would it be sufficient to help them develop their intellect? You know, I don't know. Sometimes I feel yes, sometimes I feel no. Right? When I talk to my wife, I feel absolutely not. So I think that that's something. But the next question is, pick one of the things that you surfaced and ask yourself, how do you know? How do you demonstrate? How do you know you can do that well? What evidence is there to support that? Not only in just maybe a few anecdotes, those are important, but like, what have you created that exemplifies your ability to do X, or your attitude or disposition of Y? So example I heard over here is like, yeah, knowing that you don't know and being comfortable with that. That's the disposition there, is being intellectually humble. I'm conscious of the importance and of the need to recognize the limits of my own intellect, my own my own understanding. I want to be comfortable with that. But how do I know that? What in my life demonstrates that as evidence? That's your next objective within the next 3 minutes. How do you know it? Pick one and tell me, what's the evidence? How can you like justify that skill? Yeah, piece of evidence. Well, how do you know it? Prove it. Thank you for answering that question, because if you can't, what does that tell you? If it tells you maybe that it might just be a little bit more abstract than we first may have realized. It might be one of those things where we recognize it when we see it, but I can't strategically implement it in ways that are, I don't know, I'm not telling you, that's what I would think of myself. If I can't explain what I do to evidence that, then I have to say, maybe I don't own it as much as I'd like to think. I'll let you figure that out. No problem. All right, if I can bring us back together, please. Is there a brave individual who would like to offer up proof? Oh, thanks. Yeah, I saw you raise your hand. I did. That's what I saw. I'm just telling you what I saw. Okay, can I have everyone's attention, please? Please.
One of the things I said was engagement with text is something that will sharpen my intellectual learning. And if you actually pull any book that I've read, not for fun, but for some kind of work learning reasons, you will see questions on the side, you will see words written out to find that I didn't know, you will see circled, you will see me, I should go buy this book, this relates to this other thing, it's all like actually written in the book.
So you're engaging with the text by asking the author questions or asking questions of the text itself, making connections and writing those in the margins, defining words that you don't know. All right, that's written in the book itself. All right, we have another one. What do you do? What's proof? Yeah.
I think there's some mastery of the art of narrative and translation to a number of different things. So fiction writing and using story to frame almost everything in terms of my teaching, framing.
So if I was to look at your class,
Yeah.
I would see a story.
Yeah, you can see discussion of things from a narrative perspective.
Okay.
Research.
All right.
Yeah.
So thinking is narrative or development is narrative. All right. All right. So the idea here, as it relates to students is, and us, the extent to which I can explicate that which I do or have come to do implicitly well, or that maybe I episodically practice, will reflect the extent to which I can examine it and potentially reproduce it, examine it or correct it. That's the thinking. If I ask students, and as the first example up there, to ask clarifying questions, that's pretty much nonsensical in terms of how activities are run. If they know what clarifying means, I'm looking for definitions, examples. I'm looking for connections through elaborations. I'm transferring my knowledge from one domain to another by thinking metaphorically. Looking for counterexamples. Then that's a framework that I can point to my work in concrete ways to show that I'm doing this. And over time, I can show my fluency in that development, right? Let alone, say, asking questions of depth, right? Looking for assumptions and evaluating the validity of those assumptions, looking for complexities. Contrary, what about cases that are like paradigm cases at both ends of the spectrums? When it's always true, when it's never true. What's all the juice in the middle? Those are the complexities, but it's concrete. So in servicing like what this student's timeline is right now, I like what he wrote here is like one of his blog posts, Searching Through the Abyss. He quoted himself, based up in the narrative above, I have a tendency to try to write a paper about 5 different things at once. So he's like, I wrote this post. It's truly one of my biggest challenges as a high-strung individual. What struck me about that was he was thinking about who he is as a person, his habits or predispositions, and how those might be empowering or prevent obstacles. And I like how he came to the point, some things are just better left unsaid in a paper. I was like, yeah, I mean, who hasn't struggled with that? And so as he moves forward, and other students, I'm just showing you one example, but, and I'll be aggregating these throughout the next semester into one site, but this guy, this particular student, saying, what can I do? And how can I take this knowledge and this experience, these skills forward? And I want ultimately the power to shift from them asking permission for my approval, for them asking with vague understanding of the criteria for their acceptance by an employer or another degree program, from passive to active. Let me tell you what I have done, what I can do, and let me show you how I've exemplified that in my work. More importantly, these are the things I still have to develop, because when I begin to lay that out, it shows me what I have and also what I don't have. So it's a small shift, I think, mechanically. It's a big shift conceptually. And I will say the students pushed back hard, and I pushed back harder. And ultimately, they understood and respected the idea is like, no, this is giving you the choice. But they were thinking of education as a means of through the lens of efficiency. How can I get the greatest amount of gain with the least amount of investment? And that was the biggest obstacle to overcome. I wouldn't say successfully totally overcame it, but man, we really pushed it. Now, I've just been here a year and a half, and I taught this class last fall for the first time here at VCU. 17 years ago, I started out as a high school teacher, and we weren't using timeline software like this, but the same logic was driving it with high school students. If we put the surface to thinking in manageable ways, we can hold them accountable for it. And I think that's what a lot of students need. It's hand-holding, but it's also holding them accountable for continually and consistently applying the thinking. I surfaced that video from the beginning just to highlight that we have concepts of analysis that dictate how we think about things. And despite our experience, if we take an implicit approach, that in and of itself is going to be somewhat limiting. If we surface the thinking that's driving it, we can come up with so much more of a rich concepts. And that's it. Thank you. So I work here in the Alt Lab, if anyone ever wants to follow up. Thanks, appreciate that.
Fabulous. And I'm looking forward to you helping me do these things in my courses.
I'm looking forward to it too. I really am. Thank
I'll
you.
catch up with you next week.
Cool.
That's it.